much for the invitation to talk about gardening today, and what a perfect day to do it. I'm really honored that you all chose to spend this time talking about gardening whenever it would be very, very tempting to spend the lunch hour outside actually gardening. And so again, this is something that, has always been part of my life. I come from a big Italian immigrant family. And so it was just a normal way of, of life to just grow things everywhere in your yard. And then whenever I got, to college and into my professional years, just started thinking about ways to incorporate the bigger themes around sustainability, ecology, social justice and food and all of these things into that note of sustainability. And so today is going to be, pretty light in terms of how can you create a place in your yard, in your life, in your community that allows you to, enjoy all of the relaxation benefits and occasional snacks that come out of a home gardening practice. So I'm curious how many of you are active gardeners right now? I know it's tough with the screens off and everything, but anybody dabbling or into it already? Okay, we've got we've got some, we've got maybe a toe dip, we've got anybody just like they're canning and they're homesteading and they're just really in the deep end with it. We've got a lot of dabbling. I'm just going to open up the chat function here. Some dabbling, some vegetables in pots. That's great. We're going to talk today about different approaches to find, ways to grow things no matter what your space issue is or your interest as well. And again, it's perfect time. We've had so many cold nights during this long, slow, cool spring. And so hopefully last night was the last one where plants would have to be covered or taken inside. I mean, no promises at all, but we're getting pretty close to that fail-safe frost-free date. So it's a great time to think about pretty much growing whatever you want right now. Oh, and canning, yep. Canning would be fun. That's a whole other level of production. Maybe we'll have another chat about that towards the fall. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, share the presentation. And I think a great way to kick this off is, two questions for you to ask yourself. What experience do you want to have in your yard? And secondly, what limiting factors do you have? It's so easy to look at HGTV or at gardening magazines or homesteading websites and blogs and just see perfect rows and wood chipped paths and spiral gardens and beautiful English gardens with moss covered walls. And, and it can almost intimidate you to the point that you don't want to, because let's be honest, it's a pleasure to grow things, but it does take a little bit of time and a little bit of money, a little bit of resources, even though there are ways to reduce that impact on you, because everybody here, I'm positive, is multitasking and living a pretty complicated existence right now. So the goal of this is just to answer that question: what experience do you want to have in your yard? And what limiting factors do you have? And construct it in a way that it's not super stressful to you. Okay, so hopefully the presentation is showing. Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize the faces and the chat. So maybe Sam, I could lean on you that if anybody has something to address, please interrupt me or a question or something like that, just to kind of keep my eyes forward here. So again, when I think about my garden and the purposes for it, there's so many different ways to take an approach. Again, it doesn't have to be a neat, traditional, super highly productive row vegetable garden, unless that's what you want. Are you looking at a small space? Maybe you have a patio, maybe even a balcony, or as in my case, I have a really tiny yard that is kind of captive. It doesn't get a lot of full sun. But last year when pandemic panic hit, we built raised beds and put a small patio for 2 chairs right in the middle of it. and we're able to grow a pretty good amount of food. And it really gave a lot of pleasure in basically an urban space that from my back door to the alley needed to completely be bulldozed. So, but that's an unrealistic and a big project in and of itself. But even within that challenging space, it was possible to create beauty and food, a space to relax, feel closer to nature, and things like that. So, I mean, how many people don't want to take, their coffee? How many people, I should say, would love to take their coffee and potentially a good book or a loved one and just sit in the yard during the early hours of the day and relax? And so that's one experience, just simply creating green around you, especially if you're in a place where it's difficult to get green in an urban environment. We've all been entertaining and enjoying company with our friends and loved ones outside this last year. So again, this is an example of a really small space where maybe the focus is creating green, creating a place with good airflow and relaxation, but it doesn't at all feel survival or limited because of COVID restraints. It's really just creating a space where folks can enjoy each other's company and relax. And so there's lots of low maintenance ways to create green spaces around you. And so we'll talk a little bit today about how to pick a plant palette. Do you have a favorite color? Again, what's your goal? Do you want to surround yourself with fragrance, with plants that attract pollinators, with simple, low maintenance, low watering needs, but green, resilient things that can stand the heat of summer and sun or shade, whatever the conditions are. So it's just good to start like literally with your daydream of how would you enjoy your space. I don't know about you, but especially after existing for so long in the Zoom environment almost exclusively, there's so many daydreams in my head about creating a space like this. What if it was possible to take a shed, or, we all had pre-COVID the joke about she sheds and a little escape pod, but the idea of a low impact, low footprint, project like this, of course, has a big price tag and commitment to it, but it just gives the idea of within your ability and means, if the idea is to take advantage of the working from home in the summer to create a nice, pleasant, calm workspace outside. We all know there's so many health benefits to being in nature. It lowers our respiration rate. It lowers blood pressure. The Japanese have a term for the practice of forest bathing called Shinrin-yoku. And this is supported by evidence-based science that there are changes in the human body after spending a certain amount of time in nature. And so again, great beginning to the growing season to start thinking about how to create a space for work and play that just gives you, pleasure and calmness, and therefore supports all of the other work that you're doing. This is a dream. This will probably stay on my vision board forever, but still, it's good to have dreams. For those with littles, there's so much learning, STEM type education that can happen, whether it's with kids, grandkids, neighbors, friends, whatever, just to get kids having their hands in the soil. So the opportunities there are really endless. A low-hanging fruit, pun intended, a low-hanging fruit way to approach this is doing something like a pizza garden, where you would simply grow easy to find herbs like basil, oregano, a couple of tomato plants, peppers maybe, and you can do it in the shape of a pizza, like a circle, and just have the kids help grow, and then inevitably, hopefully enjoy those toppings on some pizza at some point later on in the summer. And so this can be done for, say, salsa garden or something like that. So if the littles in your life happen to have, or the bigs as well, right? Who doesn't love pizza and salsa? But it could be a great way to have a little bit of garden harvest party at some point and invite a couple people over, or just you yourself enjoy the harvest in a way that sort of has a theme to it, but takes a very small footprint. Again, this is something that could also be constructed in containers. So last summer, being home all the time, standing, again, I'm in a very dense area here in Pittsburgh, and I was, standing outside, and I was admiring my neighbor's yard. So I can see several neighbors' homes to that way and several neighbor homes that way. And for those of my neighbors who have been here for 10, 20 years, they really have put in a lot of beautiful flowering plants as well as bird feeders and things like that. And so we really got to enjoy the fruits of their labor, so to speak, in having access to just watching a lot of hummingbirds come. And again, just being able to see that nature and just think about those hummingbirds are commuting, if you will, in the winter the whole way to South America. And thinking about that little creature, thinking about monarch butterflies and how they, over a couple of generations in one season, migrate the whole way from Mexico to Canada and back, fly at elevations higher than 10,000 feet. They've been spotted by pilots. The thought about providing a respite, food, habitat for these creatures that just are absolutely amazing survivalists without all the impact of dense urban development is phenomenal. And working at the past on green buildings and especially green rooftops and things like that in other parts of my career, there's this point in downtown, if you know the Energy Innovation Center, where the Penn State office is, the Covestra Center, Pitt has an engineering lab or something there. And if you stand up at that rooftop garden and you close your eyes and do a little bit of a thought experiment, you can project in your mind, the convention center. For those of you who are in the area, down by the river, you have the convention center with a rooftop garden, the Allegheny County building that's on the Monongahela side of the city. They've got a big monitored rooftop garden. And if you start thinking about where all of these things exist, you realize that people have created a superhighway for these creatures that are really important pollinators, really important actors in the food chain in the area, and just indicator species that we have habitat to support this life, which really does have a presence, like a global or hemispheric presence. So I like to think about, no matter how small your garden is or what little pot of flowers you might have, when you again start to think about your neighbors, their neighbors, and you start to kind of zoom out, think about all these rooftop gardens, it's really I find a lot of joy in thinking about participating in this bigger effort that connects to biodiversity and habitat creation and larger conservation efforts for some of our pollinators and birds. So, if you want to daydream in that direction, it's often fun to think about being part of that bigger picture as well with your little garden. So there's, a couple of ways to approach design, and is it degenerative or is it holistic? So when we see, these large tract developments and how is stormwater managed, and what, mitigation efforts can be put in place. Are we planting monocultures in our front yards via all grass that needs loads of water and nitrogen to look good, but is it really just, causing water waste and pollution? Or how are our farms and our food sources producing food? So there's where does that food come from? What are the food miles and embodied energy of that container of strawberries from California this time of year, as well as, fossil fuels? So there's a lot of way to again, to apply those big lessons that you all are aware of, by virtue of participating in this cohort, this opportunity that Pitt has for staff, to have awareness around that. Or do you want to approach this with regenerative design principles? So regenerative agriculture, regenerative design means working with the human built environment and different impacts to be able to support, improve, and honor ecological systems and services. So again, thinking this little, project that you may have, or the big project you may have at home, is going to have that ripple effect in the region, in that flight path, etc. So it's really nice to think about, things like nutrient cycling with composting, to think about, do you have any interest in keeping animals, and the inputs that go into them and the outputs you get from them are a fun equation to think about. Everything from pest control to protein for some grain and some grit in the case of chickens. Little raised beds, right? You can definitely grow a healthy amount of salad greens or tomatoes or whatever it is you like in a small space, as well as the socialization aspect, even if it's within your family or your pod or your unit, or in the case of a community garden with neighbors and kind of weaving together that fabric amongst the people who live close by to each other. So there's all kinds of great ways that growing, the simple act of growing something can really tie into these bigger regenerative impacts. So we'll talk a little bit about design now. What are your options? You know, sometimes it just comes down to, I have 2 hours and I'm just going to plant some stuff, and that's totally okay. And so then once that happens, it can be a hobby and an endeavor that feeds on itself and kind of picks up steam. And so you'll immediately start thinking about, well, what can I do next year? Or what can I do this fall? And so some design principles, of course, want to take advantage of space. So I'll share a couple of tools about how you can look at your space, your constraints, and select plants that will do well for you, because you want to be able to make sure that you get to see it grow in a good way and not die in the first week. Because how many people have had that experience, right? You plant something and then you slowly watch it die, and it's really frustrating, and you're like, what did I do wrong? But don't give up. Right plant, right space. So every plant, just like people, thrives in a certain environment. So again, that's something we'll talk about now in terms of design. How can you think about that plant's genetic history, its biosuitability for a space, and just, if it's a shade plant, make sure that you know that, because it'll do well in the shade, obviously not in full sun. So in terms of small spaces, again, just straight aesthetic design, it can be as rough and tumble as you want, or you can, go ahead and create, like this bottom left picture, a beautiful sort of palette almost of complementary colors with lovely pots, a background, it's neutral, but then focusing on something like yellows and greens with a touch of orange. So you can just go for aesthetics, water plants like this, as long as they're in a soil medium that can retain water, that something like that could be very low maintenance. Also, again, this is another example of how something like a pizza garden or a salsa garden could also go into containers, provided there's enough sun and you have the time to water appropriately. In the top left picture here, you see some trellised plants in little terracotta containers with the black plastic over it. So what's going on there? That's a little bit of design, and it's a little bit of kind of smart design, in that black plastic will keep insects from getting down into the soil, especially if you've got a problem with soil contaminants or flea beetles or various kinds of pests that might want to get in there and eat your plants before you can. So that's often a practice that can keep pests away. It's a physical barrier. It also retains moisture and preserves moisture. And the other thing that this can do is raise the temperature. So this would be for a very specific example where you may be in a cold area where you have a big garage, a big house, neighboring buildings, and there's not a lot of direct sun. So at the beginning, you want to be able to warm up the soil to help the plant grow and take advantage of an artificially shorter season. And you can see just little PVC pipes and brackets. Plastic PVC, admittedly not sustainable, but you can find recycled content or biodegradable materials, as well as, for heaven's sakes, there's invasive bamboo all over. And so if you know a patch, you could go, gardening, once you get into gardening circles or Facebook pages or talk to neighbors that garden, people say, oh, like last year, somebody said, in the North Hills behind this one grocery store, there's a huge patch of bamboo. And, and then everyone's like, oh, I'm going to go on Thursday and cut it, because that's what you use for staking. So it's kind of fun just to see how creative you can be. So I don't want to hold up plastics as an example, because there's always a substitute. And oftentimes it's free in that case. And then on the right, a great rooftop garden. You obviously have investment in a system that is connected to a water supply, a trellising where it's needed. But I like this picture because it just showed, again, how creative folks are to grow food. And there's always a way to do it, no matter what your space limitations are. I also really like the fact that this rooftop garden, that those orange flowers in the front are nasturtium, and they're edible and they're spicy. And if you take those orange blossoms, they have kind of like a bell shape at the back. If you stuff those with goat cheese and pine nuts, for example, you've got like a ready appetizer for whenever you go sit down and hang out with your loved ones or yourself in your garden. So again, just thinking about how plants can be used for both color and food. So in thinking about design, you've always got to ask yourself, which way does the wind blow? I think this is one of those tenets in life. We're always sort of told to ask ourselves, know which way the wind's blowing. And that is a metaphor for 1,000 things. In this case, it's literal. These little circles that you see are the way the wind blows at the secondary airports in Pennsylvania. And so pretty much that just will tell you if you've got storms coming in, where they're going to come from, or if you are situated at the top of a hill or a ridge, you need to be, make sure, just consider, do your plants need extra strong staking or trellising? Might there be wind damage at some point in the season? So as a general rule of thumb, the weather comes from the southwest here. So, but it's fun to draw them sometimes if you really get deep into garden design. Another thing is solar geometry. What is the peak angle and the low angle that the sun hits on the two solstices? So literally when you take your coffee in the morning, or you take your fizzy water or wine or whatever in the evening, and you're just observing your property, observing your yard, your patio, whatever it is, watch which way the sun moves, right? And this part is super important because you have to have at least 6 hours of direct sunlight to grow plants that are marked as full sun. So these would be all of your summer garden veggies, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, beans, etc. You have to have at least 6 hours. So as you're watching how the sun moves, this is such a wonderful time of the year because the sun's up forever. The days feel so long, lots of energy, things are growing, and that's literally by design, right? And so if you notice around December 21st, when everyone's taking vitamin D and sitting in front of their sad lamps, then you'll also notice just how little daylight there is. So what you want to do is just sort of watch how the sun moves over your property, and notice where it comes up and where it goes down over the course of the year. And what that does is when you're planning your garden, if you know, for example, that your, let's see here, like if you know, for example, that third week in June, about June 19th, June 21st is the solstice. I forget which, sorry, but right around then, you're going to have the biggest span. The sun is going to make the biggest arc in the sky. And then you'll notice again, third week in December, whenever everything slows down, you're going to notice it's a fractional position, both in terms of the arc, like where it comes up and where it sets, but also to the height of it in the sky, like where does it sit on the horizon. And so that can give you clues as to where to plant early plants. So you're going to want to pick the sunniest spot, the part of the yard that gets the most sun at both of those points in the year, to have the most productivity in the case of flowers or annual vegetables. And that's because they're going to have the energy of the sun to help them grow. So for example, I have a very shady, cool, wet part of my yard. So I save that to plant until this time of year. But the part that's always in the sun, it's the first place I plant early, cold, hardy greens. Then I put my main summer stuff in, and then it's the place where I will cycle that out and put items in that can grow like until the killing freezes come. And so in some of those sunny places, you can get multiple rounds of different types of vegetables in if you want to play around with growing with the calendar. So that's again, and same thing if you just love big, oh gosh, I'm like blanking on some of the ornamentals, but if you love some really, some of the big shade loving plants as well that might be perennials, then put them in the shade and they'll grow, and you can turn a dark, cool spot into someplace that's still productive and beautiful just by knowing how the sun moves. This slide kind of demonstrates what I was just speaking to you. So you can see that June 21st, the arc of the sun's quite high, passes over this house. and then how it sits lower in the horizon and has sort of a truncated motion around it. So again, just pay attention to that. Folks use this when they put solar panels in, but again, it's really important for the right place for the plants that you'd like to grow. So make note, we are in 6B. This has started changing every 7, 8, 9, 10 years, just because of the warming earth and climate change. And so what this hardiness zone is, it tells you what types of plants you can grow here. We've gotten a lot warmer than, say, when I was a kid, or even 20 years ago, whenever I was starting out professionally. And so what it does is it tells you the average low and high temperatures, as well as the frost dates. So this information is tracked by USDA. They've got lots of maps related to agriculture, because again, agriculture really is a national security concern and issue. So the government puts lots of interesting information and maps and data sets out around growing conditions, temperature changes, and that's very helpful to gardeners. So I don't know how many of you are gamblers, or how big of a gambler you might be. Frost dates are one of those things where you can sort of test your mettle and just see how big of a risk taker you are. So some folks put things in early, and they've been running back and forth, covering them, bringing them in, and trying to, watching things die. But when are you really safe? And so again, this is where having an understanding of plant biology can help you extend a growing season. And so for sure, if you pick plants that have biology and are native to cooler places, wetter places, they're going to do really well in spring and fall here. So it's possible that you could have, by this time in the year, over, like say last year, planted your garlic, leeks, onions, some kale, even carrots. And if they're in a protected place with hay or straw, not hay, straw or row cover cloth, they could have survived winter, right? And how wonderful is that? Even there's some cold hardy Asian greens that do well. Like for example, we grew beds worth of this little baby bok choy, and they were about that big in November. It was a big experiment. And then sure enough, end of February into March, we just had loads of it for harvest. And same thing with kale, like it overwintered successfully. So we were able to have baby kale as well, like very early in March. And so then you get your peas in, your lettuces, your radish, all that cold hardy stuff. But for things like tomatoes, peppers, green beans, zucchini, all of those like things that are just scream summer, you've got to wait for the frost date. And so this is your guide. And so here we've got, it's really awful to me. I think that's quite a short growing season, but we're just about there now. So I'm a little bit more of a gambler. I figure we're in a heat urban island, or at least where I am. And so I have some row cover cloth, and I'll put stuff in a little bit early and just take my chances. Of course, you're risking the plant's life, stunting, things like that. But if you want to play it safe, about another week, it should be just warm enough to just grow, and especially ward off things like fungal diseases. That's the Solanaceae family, like your peppers and your tomatoes and eggplants. Like they cannot tolerate cold and wet because they'll just get fungal diseases. So again, just know like mid to end of May for those peak summer things are when you are ready to plant those out. Also, anything you would plant from seed, you would do at this frost date period. End of the season, some people even put mid-October as the first frost date. So again, you just never know. Mother Nature is unpredictable if nothing else. But why not try to plan for the longest growing season possible? Okay, so we're gonna get in there now and get our hands dirty. So again, in little spaces, one of the biggest things we're gonna do, and I think the biggest question is, so we're growing plants, we're talking about growing plants, but no matter what type of gardener plant you grow, what's the other thing that you're actually growing and taking stewarding? If anybody wants to unmute, throw it in the chat. We're on the soil section. The other thing you're really doing when you garden is you grow soil. So soil used to be thought of as for a while in the 20th century, like big agribusiness era, was thought of as a medium to hold the roots. That was about it. It wanted to be sterile. You injected whatever you needed in there. Obviously this has massive, massive implications for the environment that are bigger than we can get into now, and human health, et cetera. But when you take it to a home scale, if you think about the earth and the soil as this microbiome that is as diverse as the ocean, that's closer to reality and truth. And so we want biodiversity in our soil. We want lots of humus, lots of compost, lots of straw, decomposing leaves. All of these things are going to allow nutrients to jump between the soil molecules and the plant roots so that the plants can take up the nutrients. It's going to hold water, so enough water. Again, that facilitates nutrient uptake, but also helps with having, just your chore of watering the plants every day. It also can allow, healthy soil can allow water to drain enough so that you don't get gross, stagnant, the opposite of like too little water is too much water, right? You don't get standing water, clay, like hard pack top, all that kind of stuff. So if you're working in organic matter, if you're working in those leaves, the compost, the straw in the fall, grass clippings in the summer, even if you don't have a proper compost bin, you are going to facilitate a really healthy soil biome. And I remember back in graduate school, I had this wonderful soils professor who had come here from Italy. So he was just so knowledgeable and enthralled with the soil ecosystem, and it was contagious. And I still carry that enthusiasm for the soil microbiome to this day. And, I just remember him standing up there with a 6.5 foot tall frame saying, the soil is like the ocean, and just really so passionate about it that you couldn't help but pay attention. And one of those statistics is in a square meter of soil, there's 1 billion life forms. So again, just like zooming out and thinking about those aerial highways that you create for birds and butterflies by having flowering plants and bees, that you are also doing the same thing when you garden in the soil. And sometimes it's kind of icky, but sometimes kind of interesting to see who shows up to the gardening party. We've all seen this classic composting bin. And so just wanted to say, again, the ability to compost is as easy or hard as you make it. And especially if you're tight for space, sometimes there's neighbors that have larger yards and garden, and they're very happy to let you take things there to compost. Or there's keyhole gardens where you could take some wire framing and create a circle and tuck your compost into there, but there's plants growing around it. So there's all sorts of way to compost. Again, we're like in a place without a large yard, but the idea of putting things in the landfill makes me crazy. And so we're nearby a middle school. And so we contacted the school board and said, hey, you've got this property in the back, it's wooded, there's no problems here. Could there be an area that we could use to create a little community composting area? And they agreed to it. And it's been cool to do because, again, it created relationships amongst people in the neighborhood who may not have met otherwise, which then led to, just a general sense of place of where we all live, as well as a great place to trade, or a new network to trade plants and tips and materials, so that everyone's just not doing their own thing alone, trying to figure it out. It's great how gardens also create community. Soil testing is very important. Two schools of thought, like two situations here. One, you're doing all containers, you're just going to go buy everything at Lowe's or Home Depot in a bag. So in that, what I would suggest is just read the ingredients list. If you're buying products, such as Miracle-Gro, they'll have all sorts of really cool things in there that will retain moisture, be automatic feeding and fertilizer, but do know those are synthetic, and those have act upon plants in our bodies in a way, almost like eating a candy bar does, right? It's fast, quick, cheap nutrition. It's okay, but just know that's what you're working with. Alternatively, working again with compost, native soils, leaf compost, leaf mulch, grass clippings, stuff like that. If you're working in that direction too, that's a lovely way to build soil. If you are working in the ground, it's important to know we've got tons and tons and tons of metal pollution around here. So you're going to want to know two things. Basically, what's your basic fertility profile? of your soil. So what do you need to add to it? Do you need to use supplemental fertilizer? Because it is really frustrating when your plants get sick or just are stunted, and that's because they may need fed, they're hungry. And two, what toxins are you potentially being exposed to? So just remember here, especially lead's a problem, as well as some potential other metals. And so that's actually taken up through like your skin and breathing, more so than into the plant that you then eat. So just know that that's where the danger really lies, is when you're working the soil. That's when your body is coming into contact and up and taking that up. So one thing that we do at Allegheny County Conservation District is free community-led soil screenings. We were very fortunate to be awarded a grant several years ago. We have a really cool tool called the XRF spectrometer laser gun. And it sounds sci-fi, but what it is it gives a very quick scan of the metals as well as the nutrient profile. And we do this as a service to the community. So we have one coming up here May 22nd. You can check out our Facebook page if you'd like to drop off a soil sample. We'll be announcing another one soon in partnership with Grow Pittsburgh at their Garden Resource Center in East Liberty. And so again, we'd be happy to take a soil sample from your yard, give it a zap, and just see if you are working with any, either like nutrient deficient soils, but especially looking at lead and a couple other metals we look at. And so we keep that data private. We've done about 15,000 soil samples in 4 years, and oftentimes work with community partners. So again, please feel free to reach out because, and if you miss one of these community events, we'd always be happy to make arrangements. We're doing contacts, like basically you register, it's contactless drop off just because of COVID. We want to make sure it's safe. So we're not bringing a bunch of people together in one place. So what to grow? We talked about this a little bit, just wanted to give some definitions briefly. Annuals versus perennials. So annuals, they grow, they die, they complete their life cycle in a season. Perennials, they'll come back year after year. And so a lot of perennials are natives, which creates that habitat environment. And ultimately, after they get going, a pretty low maintenance landscape. It's kind of nice to mix the two. Again, depends what you're after. Edible or ornamental, self-explanatory. So anytime you're seeing like a beautiful, like color-coded or plant-heavy container garden, you can put, there's no reason you can't put, cucumbers or bush beans or something into a pot and grow it like you might do ornamentally. The whole definition around seeds and plant origins, hybrid or genetically modified, they're usually labeled on the hybrid plant tags. What it means is you've got like, say, 2 types of tomato and they've been crossbred to get to the one that you're buying. So you cannot save seeds. GM, those are usually proprietary. And so they're owned by a corporation and you can't save seeds for those either. One, in the GM, there could be fines. It's very infrequent, it happens, but it could. The other part is that you won't know what you're going to get if you save seeds. So if you do want to save seeds, then you want to look for open pollinated or heirloom seeds or plants. This means that the plants you grow from the seeds this year, next year, will be exactly what you were expecting. And organic, again, that term simply means that a list of synthetic herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, and fertilizers weren't used in the production. So, organic is one of those like tricky terms. And then do you want to grow, what did I mean by human? Oh, a garden for pollinators or a garden for humans, right? So are you wanting to have a harvest dinner party, or do you just want to attract beautiful pollinators and birds to your yard? So keeping a record is helpful, especially if you're leaning towards natives and perennials. They are reliable. They are the natural food sources for all sorts of animals. You can oftentimes harvest parts of the plant to make tea or for herbs or spices. The thing with perennials is they're going to bloom for this period, but always be around. And so for those of you who don't like the look of unkempt gardens or like to, get rid of things as soon as they stop blooming, just be aware that the trick in the design is to think about what you want to grow and when does it bloom and when does it fruit? And so that way you can start to create an annual calendar, and you can say, this is great, you know, like these little native perennials like you see here, our spring ephemeral season is just wrapping up here in southwestern Pennsylvania. So if you love all these beautiful natives that are just treasures, and we're so lucky to live in a place where they grow, then you know you're going to see them between March and May. And then you're going to see nothing or some leaves. So then you want to go ahead and say, well, what's going to bloom after them? What will bloom midsummer, late summer, fall? And that way you can place them and arrange them in a way that if you do, you know, like to always have something blooming, and why not, then you're sort of like hiding the ones that are coming up to bat next or have just finished their life cycle, but need to keep growing so that their leaves can store enough energy for them to grow again next year. So just creating that little chart is great. Another thing about design and space use is that it's really interesting to think about this keyhole bed idea. So this is also one of those like mind-blowing tricks, that this keyhole bed takes about 6 square feet, but it grows as many plants as on a grid system, 50 square feet of plants. And it kind of looks nicer too, especially if you're in a small space. So again, there's nothing wrong with the traditional format, but with little keyhole gardens, you could put these around a patio or a path, and you could essentially, you know, grow in a few of those, which you might grow in tilling up half your yard. So it's kind of fun to just look around. If you look around with keywords like permaculture, design, you'll find a lot of little tips and tricks like this. So the annual sighting of the monarch butterfly is just, you know, wonderful. You know, summer's here. I love, again, just to think about their journey and what it means that they've survived another winter where their ecosystem's under threat in Mexico, and they found enough food to get up and get back in enough quantity that the species still exists. So it's just tough out there for everything. And so how can you help? Pollinator gardens are one way. And so you may know this, but many butterflies have what's called a larval plant, which means that they can only lay their eggs, and when they hatch, the larva can only eat one species of plant. So there's this beautiful like coevolution that's happened over time, where these plants and these animals need each other to exist. So in the case of monarchs, it's milkweed. And so it's very easy. I think even one of milkweed's common name is like ditchweed or something like that. It grows on the sides of roads, bad soil, kind of swampy, you know, standing water, just kind of like not the nicest places. But if that plant didn't grow, we would not have the species of monarchs. And so it's quite a lovely flower when it blooms. It's these beautiful like pink pom-poms on about 2 to 3 foot alternating leaf stems. So they've got a beautiful form. So why not tuck them in a place where in your yard that might have a little bit of wet feet in the soil, a little bit of semi-shade, and it might be a place where you can't really grow too much else, but you could look forward to seeing these visitors every year on their journey. Really space constrained, you know, hummingbirds and butterflies will take anything that they can, you know, that has that like tube shape at the back of the flower. So this came from Holland Bulb Farm, are ready to go. I don't work for them, I'm not recommending them, but you know, you can look for these vertical hanging deals, and you can put them on a fence or the side of a house or a garage, and you can create some habitat. And again, it's super low maintenance. You have to remember to water it is the biggest thing. Pluck off the flowers that have stopped blooming so the next round of flowers come. But that's about as easy as it gets if you just like to kind of have some color, have some texture, detract from like a plain wall, but invite some creatures in to hang out in your yards that you can observe their behavior. Similarly, this was something that you can buy off of Wayfair. I don't work for them, don't get a commission, not recommending it. But if you really look closely at this, couldn't you make this out of recycled or repurposed materials, right? So you probably have some masonry screws, you know, to anchor those boards in the back. And then you have some kind of container that can be affixed to that, and it is strong enough to hold the soil, the plant, and the water that passes through. But what a neat idea to create vertical habitat, dress up a plain wall, and grow whatever it is that you like to grow, whether it's herbs or flowers, or a combination of both. Again, kind of a mix there. You might expect to see flowers here or a more traditional kind of garden layout around this pergola, but instead you see beets and cabbages. So again, why not? Just be creative, just plant things where you think they have a good shot at growing, and why not do some landscape design with a combination of vegetables, and in the back you can see some perennial flowers. This one as well, pretty low maintenance, just creating some geometric designs, removing the grass. There's places, especially if you live near Pittsburgh, or many municipalities have like wood chip pickup or drop off day. So oftentimes, again, you can find some free or low cost, or just go get it yourself, sources of gardening materials. And same thing, old bricks, you know, things like that. You can go to Construction Junction, see what kind of materials might be available there. But then again, you know, where it's shady, put shade-loving plants or perennials, and where it's sunny, that's where you can grow a lot of your fun main season crops. Put a little bit of a water feature in there for your pollinators to stop and get a drink. And then, you know, this is something that could grow literally and evolve after a couple of seasons into something that is quite robust. I have a neighbor who a decade ago just took out all of their grass, normal city-sized lot on a corner under a big tree, lots of shade. Their yard is one of the most beautiful yards I've ever seen in my life. I kind of want to like do a painting of it and give it to them as a gift, just because I get so much pleasure of walking by it with my dog, you know, every day, year after year. So again, gardening is never static. It's never done. You've never failed, and you've only ever always just begun. And I think that's part of the fun of creating like a practice of gardening that suits your temperament and your resources that particular year. Espalier is simply, you know, having a fruit tree trained to grow flat. And so the French perfected this, and it's used to great artistic design as well as, you know, culinary delight as well. So again, this is a project that would take years, but if you love, you know, if that's where you live and it's your home, what a little low maintenance hobby that could turn into something really, really cool, again, to sort of cover up a fence line or a plain wall. And you could do this with any fruit plant, any fruit tree. This is an example of a midsummer, just gorgeous perennial planting. And so you can see the varied in heights and textures, tall stuff in the back, short stuff in the front. And a lot of these, like in the back, you've got echinacea, which can be used to make tea to support immune system function. In the front, you've got Oswego tea, which again is like beautiful and can be made to make dye. It also attracts loads of pollinators. On the left, that's called listeria. It is a prairie flower that can grow in almost drought-like conditions and comes back and blooms right around 4th of July. You don't really have to do much after planting and watering all of that well the first year. So again, a border or a corner, cultivating it. And the really great thing about perennials is that you have to, like, one of the ways to maintain them is to divide them. And so once you get going with it, you can populate more and more and more of your yard, or trade with other gardeners as well. And so it can be a way that you don't have to, like, year after year spend loads and loads of money. But these, again, are larval plants. They're natives. They're kind of built for all of the weather that we get here and can survive in those conditions. And again, finally, just thinking about, isn't one of the best gifts we can give ourselves a beautiful place to relax and enjoy our downtime, or a beautiful place to, you know, be productive and creative and do our work during the good weather that we have here to look forward to in southwestern PA. And so just some ideas here, a combination of containers as well as a little border area that wouldn't take a lot of time to plant. And again, there's no reason that this can't be all edibles or a combination of edibles and ornamentals. So you're really only limited by your imagination there. And it's possible to just create a space that you and your family and your friends can enjoy this year, and just think about how to tweak it next year, and just, you know, really, you know, be proud of that space and enjoy the time that you put into creating it, but also in using it. This was a little, I think I opened with this sort of closing slide here in terms of, again, thinking about the connectivity between all of the efforts of all of the gardeners and conservationists that are doing work to, again, like zoom out and create these like pit stops so that all of the different pollinators and migratory birds, still have habitat and a place to rest and refuel as they go through their own life cycle patterns. And little container gardens, patio gardens, backyard gardens are certainly part of that equation. A couple of resources, I'll share the slide deck. Mother Earth News is a website and a magazine. They have a great tool called What to Plant Now. We're in the Mid-Atlantic. So if you navigate there online, month by month, it will tell you what to plant by seed and what you can direct plant that can survive the weather conditions. So it really makes it easy. If you have questions, every state with the land grant university has a Master Gardener program. Here, that's Penn State. And so I think they're just doing like calls and emails now. You can say, oh my gosh, what's this bug? Why is this dying? This leaf looks weird, or I just need some advice, or a more in-depth soil test. Penn State's another place you can get a soil test. So anyway, Master Gardeners are great gardening resources, and it's a program around the country too. So if you just look at little different Master Gardener program websites, lots and lots of information just to be got online. Beechwood Nature Preserve, it's part of the Audubon Society's properties. They have a fantastic native plant nursery. They had a sale recently. So anyway, but they're there at their gift shop. They're in Fox Chapel. And so that's a great place if you want to purchase some flowers and just, there's some flower that you really love that's a native ephemeral. It's a great place to get it. That's pretty easy. And again, there's our website if you're interested in free soil screenings. And the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh has a seed library program, just in case, and there's all kinds of informal and formal seed swaps happening all the time. So again, you can talk to your neighbors, the garden, family members, Facebook group pages. There's all sorts of, it's just a big community that will just start to unfold in front of you as you get going, and I hope you do. So with that, any questions?
So Heather, we did have a question come through the chat. They said, can you talk about choosing types of soil for different types of small gardens and how best to use soil from compost?
Yes, great question. So if you are using containers, it's important, that's one where I may recommend, even if you've got good topsoil, to potentially, mix it with a lot of composted manure or compost, because it's just such a unique thing, right? Like that little vessel, it has to stay cool enough, it has to hold water correctly, and also provide nutrients. And so I think with that, like the biggest thing is you don't want to use all topsoil because it'll just get really hard packed. And then the water and the nutrients and the root systems the plant might not grow as much as possible. I'm always going to lead towards organic blends over synthetic bagged soil blends. So again, just read the ingredient list. If you see something like urea, you're in the synthetic fertilizer part of the options. And again, that's a bigger issue than we really have time for here today. But just know, like, that's in the synthetic arena. If you want to lean towards a more kind of like natural organic arena, then you'll see ingredients like composted chicken manure, things that are, you're just kind of like, ew, instead of just seeing like, ammonia or like urea, like that's like, oh, okay, well, I don't know, that's fine. But if you see things that you can, it's like food. If you can kind of know what those ingredients are, you see green sand, like those are all things that are more in the sustainable and organic. So the biggest thing for containers and hanging baskets is just make sure that there's enough organic matter in there, that it's a little bit lighter and fluffy than you're going to have with topsoil. Super mindful of watering. If you do raised beds, I suggest a mix of 50-50 soil and compost. And get your pitchfork and sort of zhuzh it up and mix it together, and that usually works pretty well. So I say 50-50 for raised beds. If you're working straight in the soil, again, remember, the most biologically active part of soil is the top, like a couple of inches. And it's the most valuable, one of the most valuable and precious resources we have on earth. And so, you know, including your backyard. And so, you know, there's rototillers. You know, sometimes you're going to have a go with that at first, but after that, you're going to want to basically use a pitchfork, or Johnny Seed Company sells something called a broad fork if you're doing a very big garden. And essentially, you know, you dig the tines in, put your weight on it and rock it back and forth and kind of like loosen it up and jiggle it rather than like turn everything over and pulverize the soil. You're not going to want to pulverize the soil. So if you can kind of get your garden bed prepared in the ground, loosen it up like that, and then you get your leaf mulch, your grass clippings, maybe some side dressing of compost, like right where you're going to put the plant root ball. And you do that a couple times in the season. That should get you pretty far. Remember, you kind of want to protect the soil. So once your garden is planted and established, if you can find like clean straw or your grass clippings, or, you know, leaf, like if you've got trees, just keep the leaves every year. Put them in a little wire pen, let them kind of compost, you know, put that on the soil. If you just get into that practice of always sort of adding to the soil like that, and you do your nutrient test every year just to see if you do need to get into something like fish emulsion or some other, you know, organic like pellets, or, you know, there's all kinds of fertilizers out there, then that should give you the right combination of nutrients as well as soil, like the texture of the soil that you want. Yeah. So containers and baskets, maybe lean towards bagged, raised beds, 50-50 soil and compost in the dirt, in the actual soil in the ground. You're going to want to keep that loose, keep it fed. You're feeding the soil there.
Awesome. And then we had another question. Do you have any suggestions for native plants to plant in the area of land between the sidewalk and the street?
I have never heard that term, and that's awesome. So, and I have, yeah, this is a problem. And are people going to respect it, or is it all going to be like a lost cause? So I would say, again, how does the sun move? Have an idea of the sun, pick appropriately, and be prepared to amend that soil, because it is usually the worst compacted like soil and stuff like that. So I'd be prepared with that pitchfork again, loosen it up, get some compost and leaves in there. But if you've got sun, you know, something like a zinnia flower is super hardy. I mean, zinnias can take heat, very little water. They're kind of like rough and ready plants, but they bloom like ready to go. Also think about the traffic on your street before you plant anything edible, just because if you're going to get a lot of that PM2, or you're going to get the black carbon, you know what I mean? If you're going to have a lot of traffic or trucks and stuff that are passing right by, you might get some toxin settling, so you might want to stick with ornamentals. If that's not a concern, you know, why not plant whatever you want if you got some extra tomatoes or peppers? But I tend to stick towards like ornamentals, or, you know, plant like flowering plants in that arena. But there's a lot of urban gardeners that have done really interesting kind of like social activism, planting in those areas, by working with neighbors or just guerrilla style, you know, planting food and just doing that in food desert areas. So again, there's a lot of interesting perspectives on what you could do with that area out there. But I just say, again, be super mindful of the traffic that's passing, and if it would make the edibles dangerous to eat. But zinnias are my go-to for that space, because, or like coneflower if you want a native echinacea, because they're tough.
Awesome. And then we had another one that said a question about deterring neighbors knotweed from getting into their garden. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Flamethrower? I don't know. That is tough, because the way those roots spread underground, my heart is with you. That's a struggle. If you could cooperatively work together to try and dig it out, but if you can't, I would just say stay on top of it, dig it out, weed whack it, cut it back. That's just such a terrible, tenacious, invasive. It's tough to get rid of, and usually it's through mechanically, you know, just mechanically removing it, and then keeping it like cut so the plant foliage can't store energy, because that plant's really difficult to kill.
Along those lines, do you have any recommendations on how to deter your neighbor's bamboo from coming into your yard?
Same thing. Now, there are some, ways that you can get, I don't know the mil thickness, 20 mil, but you would have to bury it like so far down below the root zone and so far around. But there are barrier interventions, that if you look up how thick does the barrier have to be so that the rhizomes can't like punch through it. But again, you'd have to be really mindful of, you'd have to trace the root systems to make sure that you put that barrier below, and gave like a margin of error. So you'd want to be looking at the correct thickness and material that it couldn't punch through. But that's going to be a project, but it could be worth it for sure. Otherwise, turn them into garden stakes you can sell. And no, it's tough. Knotweed and bamboo are just terrible invasives. And conversation like, hey buddy, what if we like had a pizza night after digging? Like, I don't know. It's just, yeah, it's hard. Neighbor relations can be very hard. In this, in this kind of conversation. So potentially barriers, but just don't give it a chance to have the leaves up to keep photosynthesizing and providing energy for growth. Digging.
And then to create a backyard that attracts wildlife, would you say having like a little water source is necessary? And if so, how would you prevent that from becoming a habitat for mosquitoes?
Good question. I don't think it's 100% necessary, because again, there's going to be something in the bigger zoom out environment to provide water, but it can't hurt. And again, simply this would be a good question for master gardeners. Off the top of my head, I can't name a non-toxic product, but for sure there's things that there's additives to waters, like, my vocabulary is failing me, if you have water, there was a picture, I'm so sorry. Anyway, if you're going to have water features that are open, then there are different options for additives to them so that you don't create a mosquito factory. And that's definitely an important and kind thing for you to think about for the health of the creatures and humans in your neighborhood for sure. But there's some products out there. I'm sorry, I would have to research to give you some examples. But you're a good garden center, master gardener resources, something that leans, like the Mother Earth News, like there's going to be like a .edu sort of thing. They're going to provide some options for something like that. Megan shares, I've heard good things about mosquito dunks. Thank you. I mean, so I just say like biggest advice is have fun, just enjoy yourself. That's the thing. Gardening should be a pleasure and is not about perfection. So just, give it a try and trade, and feel free to ask questions. And, Sam has my email address in case anybody wants to follow up, and I can share the slide deck with her. So again, I just hope you all have a great summer and a great growing season.